Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has postponed next month's parliamentary elections, which would have been held for the first time in 15 years.
قررنا تأجيل موعد إجراء الانتخابات التشريعية لحين ضمان مشاركة القدس وأهلها في هذه الانتخابات.
Human Rights Watch released a major report saying for the first time that Israel's committing crimes of apartheid and persecution in the occupied Palestinian territories.
Pursuant to an Israeli government policy to maintain the domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians.
This was applying the law to the facts we documented, which reached the conclusion that the reality on the ground is one of apartheid for millions of Palestinians.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
Unrest, sparked by the potential eviction of Palestinians from their homes by Israeli authorities.
Then in April came weeks of protest and confrontation.
And these protesters see that as part of a broader effort to drive them from East Jerusalem.
Israeli police and army have so far been heavy-handed with both journalists and those voicing their solidarity.
Starting at Damascus Gate, encroaching into the courtyards of the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound.
Over 300 Palestinians and 20 police were injured. And this is all at a site which is hugely sensitive.
Tear gas, stun grenades, sponge-tip bullets, physical force, and in some cases that appeared unwarranted, disproportionate or indiscriminate.
The tremors were felt in Gaza.
Hamas explicitly cited the events in Sheikh Jarrah and Al-Aqsa as justification for its launch of rockets towards Jerusalem in May.
All throughout the day and into the night, explosions reverberated through Gaza City as Israel intensified its onslaught.
And we will further intensify the power of our attacks. Hamas will be getting blows it will not expect.
If they want to escalate, the resistance is ready. If they want to stop, the resistance is ready.
Gaza is not Israel's only front. In the West Bank, tensions hit new highs. Palestinians died in numbers on the streets of the territory.
Today is Nakba Day, is the day that Palestinians mention and commemorate their catastrophe in the founding of the State of Israel.
In November, Sheikh Jarrah's Palestinian families and the Settler Corporation rejected a compromise deal from the Supreme Court.
آن الأوان أن تنتهي نكبتنا لنعيش مع آبائنا وأبنائنا وبناتنا من دون شبح التهجير.
Israel's longest-serving prime minister has fallen after 12 years at the helm of Israel's government. And this is the man crowning the end of the Benjamin Netanyahu era.
אני מודיע היום שבכוונתי לפעול בכל כוחי כדי להקים ממשלת אחדות לאומית יחד עם ידידי יאיר לפיד.
Bennett's ascent to power in Israel means the country avoids yet another election, but it will undoubtedly mean a setback for Palestinians.
Ben & Jerry's is pulling its ice cream from Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory.
A massive win for the Palestinian boycott, divestment and sanctions movement.
More than 30 states in the U.S. have passed anti-BDS legislation in recent years. I will appeal to them one by one and ask them to enforce these laws against Ben & Jerry's.
At least 6 Palestinian prisoners have escaped from a high-security Israeli prison. They dug a tunnel under the Gilboa prison just north of the occupied West Bank.
Look at it. Social media users drew the Hollywood parallels, some mocking Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. Israeli security forces have launched a massive search for the 6 fugitives, 4 of whom were serving life sentences.
Palestinian rights activists have called on the international community to pressure Israel to withdraw a controversial decision designating 6 human rights groups as terrorist organizations. It gives Israeli forces powers to raid offices, arrest activists, and freeze bank accounts.
This campaign and pressure should continue in order to cause for the Israelis to cancel their decision.
Miss Universe is...
The South African government has withdrawn its support for Miss South Africa. The move is aimed at showing support for Palestinian people.
Right now, it is quite widely documented. It is well known that Israel is an apartheid state, essentially.
In the Miss Universe contest held this past Sunday at Israel's Red Sea resort of Eilat, Miss Bahrain, the first ever contestant from a Gulf nation, took part. And we also saw there the first representative from Morocco in the competition.
There's growing fury in Palestine after Britain's Home Secretary says she's banning Hamas. Until now, the UK had only blacklisted Hamas's military wing.
We condemn the unjust British decision to consider Hamas a terrorist organization and affirm that it's a political decision.
Jordan says it has foiled a plot by a former crown prince to destabilize the kingdom.
The king's half-brother, Hamza bin Hussein, had been under investigation for some time.
He denies the conspiracy claims, but he's very critical of the king's leadership.
I am not the person responsible for the breakdown in governance, for the corruption, and for the incompetence.
Prince Hamza appears to have backed down.
Signed a letter saying, "We must all stand behind the king in his efforts to protect Jordan."
Jordan and Israel have signed a water for energy deal in Dubai. Jordan will provide Israel with clean energy via UAE-built solar panels in its vast deserts.
The United Arab Emirates Foreign Minister Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed met Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. He's the most senior Emirati dignitary to visit Syria since the civil war broke out 10 years ago.
قمة عربية لازم تكون قمة جامعة. إن شاء الله تكون انطلاقة جديدة للعالم العربي اللي راه ممزق.
الجزائر تعتبر أنه حان الأوان لعودة سوريا لحظيرة الجامعة العربية.
Flooding has resulted in families losing all their belongings.
الانتخابات المبكرة مطلب شعبي.
الحبل الأزرق في إصبعي وإن شاء الله يكون اليوم في إصبع كل عراقي.
الانتخابات هي مو مطلب جماهير، الانتخابات هو مطلب السلطة.
طالعين ضد العملية الانتخابية بالكامل. والله احنا حاليا بحيرة، إذا ننتخب يعني هم أصلا مقررين لمن ينتخبون، وإذا ما ننتخب صوتنا راح يضيع وهم راح يختاروا.
A record low turnout. Many Iraqis believe this election may be more for show than real change.
Saada's led the poll. He's got 73 seats so far.
An explosion followed by gunfire on Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi's residence in the most secure part of Iraq.
One of the worst financial crises in 150 years. That is how the World Bank describes the current state of Lebanon.
Shortages are pushing up the costs of many essentials. The price of subsidized bread has been hiked 5 times this year alone.
بنزين غلي، أكل شرب غلي، كل العالم جاهد. أنا ما بعد تاكل وما تشرب.
هاي الدولة فاشلة.
الشارع مقسوم لقسمين، قسم لأنه جاع وقسم لأنه بده التغيير.
The president brokered a deal after 13 months of squabbling. Lebanon's richest man, telecoms tycoon Najib Mikati, has been named prime minister.
He's familiar with the position, having served as prime minister 2 times before.
This is the 3rd attempt to form a government since the port explosion in Beirut.
آمل إنه نقدر نوصل للي بيشتهيه الناس ونقدر نرجع على القليلة نوقف الانهيار اللي حاصل.
Lebanon's information minister George Kardahi's comments calling the war in Yemen a Saudi aggression triggered the worst deterioration in relations in years. For weeks, Kardahi rejected calls to resign.
لا أقبل بأن أستخدم سبباً لأذية لبنان وإخواني اللبنانيين في المملكة العربية السعودية وفي دول الخليج الأخرى. لذلك قررت التخلي عن موقع الوزاري.
Turkey's currency, the lira, has tumbled to an all-time low against the US dollar. Turkey's president cited Muslim teachings to justify his decision not to raise interest rates to stabilize the currency.
تعلن دولة الإمارات عن تأسيس صندوق استثماري بقيمة 10 مليار دولار للاستثمار في قطاعات استثمارية في جمهورية تركيا.
Asylum seekers are said to have been illegally picked up by Greek police and deported to Turkey.
Locals living here are angry. They are short on water.
Security forces in Iran's Khuzestan province have been firing bullets at people protesting over a severe lack of water.
By the time it got to Tehran, they were chanting "Death to the dictator," referring to the supreme leader. The current water crisis was exacerbated by the Iranian government's mismanagement of its water supplies.
Iran has been targeted by a series of cyber attacks, disrupted gasoline sales, and train services were delayed.
The outgoing president and his incoming replacement side by side.
He is inheriting a dwindling economy and a difficult foreign policy.
امیدوارم که این اعتماد مردم، رأی مردم و محبت مردم رو من بتونم در طول مدت مسئولیتم ان شاء الله.
The only success story of the Arab Spring is truly in tatters.
القرار الأول يتمثل في تجميد كل اختصاصات المجلس النيابي. ستتولى رئاسة النيابة العمومية.
The parliamentary speaker slammed the move as a coup.
Hundreds rallied in Tunis and other cities.
A nighttime curfew has been imposed after clashes between supporters and opponents of the move occurred across the country.
الأزمة التي مرت بها تونس لا تبرر الانقلاب على الديمقراطية، تبرر حوار وطني، تبرر الإصلاح.
Saeed also announced a 3-month popular consultation ahead of a constitutional referendum in July 2022.
تنظم انتخابات تشريعية إن شاء الله تعالى يوم 17 من شهر ديسمبر من سنة 22 و2000.
Najla Bouden has been plucked from relative academic obscurity and thrust into the spotlight.
لأول مرة امرأة تتولى رئاسة حكومة.
Tension has been rising for weeks between military and civilian factions sharing power in a fragile transitional government.
حل مجلس السيادة الانتقالي وإعفاء أعضائه. خامساً حل مجلس الوزراء.
The country's Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok is under house arrest. International flights to the capital Khartoum have been suspended, while the internet has been cut.
Nearly a month after a military takeover, deposed Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok signed an agreement that paved the way for Hamdok to be reinstated.
استطعنا أن نؤسس تأسيس حقيقي لفترة انتقالية كما تصورناها وكما تخيلها الشعب السوداني.
خلينا نحقن هذا الدم ونوفر طاقات هذا الشباب للبناء والتعمير.
But the main opposition grouping, the Forces of Freedom and Change, says it won't recognize any deal with the military.
At least 40 protesters have been killed since the military took over.
One of the costliest traffic jams in history, a massive container ship the size of a skyscraper has blocked the Suez Canal, causing a huge backlog.
About 30,000 cubic meters of sand were dredged from around the Ever Given during the rescue, with tugboats working around the clock to pull the enormous vessel free.
For the first time in nearly 5 years, Egypt's president has announced the end of a years-long state of emergency.
The state of emergency also granted authorities sweeping powers to make arrests against dissidents and control everyday life.
It's the first official visit of an Israeli leader in more than a decade.
اتفاقية الخيانة للتطبيع مع العدو
43 عام وإحنا كنحييو هذا اليوم الدولي للتضامن مع الشعب الفلسطيني، كنحيوه بدون مشكل، لم نمنع أبدا، ولكن هذه المرة تمنعنا أول مرة نمنع.
المغاربة اليوم عبروا من خلال صناديق الاقتراع على نيتهم في التغيير، لأنهم ينتظرون التغيير، يتوقون البديل.
اتصلت بالسيد الرئيس عزيز غنوش وهنأته
احتلال حزبه المرتبة الأولى، ونحن نعتبر أن اليوم هو انتصار للديمقراطية في المغرب.
Algeria cuts diplomatic ties with Morocco.
In August, Algeria broke off relations with Morocco, accusing the country of several offences.
This goes back decades to the 1970s when Morocco tried to take control of the Western Sahara, which had been a formerly Spanish colony.
The border shared by Morocco and Algeria has been closed since 1994, and the two countries have long been at loggerheads over Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara.
North African rivals Morocco and Algeria meet.
Fallout between France and Algeria. Relations take another hit as President Emmanuel Macron reportedly defends France's colonial legacy.
Macron went as far as to question whether the Algerian nation even existed before it was colonized by France, and that the current system had been weakened by the recent pro-democracy movement that toppled the late president Abdelaziz Bouteflika. In response, Algiers recalled its ambassador, accusing Macron of interfering in its internal affairs.
باش نحل مجلس الشعب الوطني الحالي سنمر مباشرة من بعد إلى انتخابات.
Algerians remain widely skeptical about reforms promised by the president. The protest movement that galvanized the nation in 2019 against the ruling class is now calling for a boycott, a lower turnout that could further deepen the country's political crisis.
After years of divisions, Libya's new unity government is formed in the eastern city of Tobruk.
Now is the time for Libyans to forgive each other and forget the past.
حكومة الوحدة الوطنية تعهدت أمام الشعب الليبي بأنها ستسلم السلطة إلى حكومة منتخبة. الانتخابات ستجري يوم 24 ديسمبر إن شاء الله.
نحن ضد مجرمين الحرب في الترشح.
نحن مع الانتخابات، لكن هذه الانتخابات يجب أن تتم بناء على قوانين حقيقة، بناء على قاعدة دستورية أو الاستفتاء على الدستور.
تدشين خط البحري بين مصراتة وإزمير، أولى رحلة للركاب بعد توقف حوالي 25 سنة.
بعد انقطاع 40 أو 50 سنة يعني ترد ليبيا الحمد لله للإقلاع وللإبحار بالباخرة.
Prominent women's rights activist Loujain Al-Haloul was released from a Saudi prison after nearly 3 years behind bars for allegedly seeking to change the Saudi political system.
A US intelligence report has concluded that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman personally approved the murder of the exiled journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. He was killed while visiting the Saudi consulate in the Turkish city of Istanbul.
The United States of America approved its first multi-million-dollar arms deal to Saudi Arabia under President Biden's administration.
It comes months after President Biden announced the U.S. was ending support for the Saudi-led military offensive in Yemen.
We're going to continue to support and help Saudi Arabia defend its sovereignty and its territorial integrity and its people.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has announced he will designate the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. The United States government will revoke terrorist designations of Yemen's Houthi movement, reversing a policy imposed in the final days of the Trump administration.
This intent to revoke that designation has nothing to do with our view of the Houthis and their reprehensible conduct.
The long-running dispute between Qatar and its Gulf neighbours appears to be at an end after the signing of a document by leaders at a meeting of the Gulf Cooperation Council in Saudi Arabia.
The Arab world is sometimes in the headlines for the wrong reasons.
Qatar kicks off the Arab Cup football tournament just 1 year before hosting the highly anticipated FIFA World Cup 2022.
Israel's Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has arrived in the United Arab Emirates. This is the highest level visit since the Abraham Accords declaration. And he was also welcomed by a guard of honor.
The United Arab Emirates is moving its weekend. People there will now get Saturday and Sunday off instead of Friday and Saturday. The UAE working week will now be just 4.5 days long. Other steps over the past year include moves to liberalise laws on alcohol and cohabitation before marriage.